In this step-by-step tutorial, you'll learn the basics of Python f-strings. We'll cover what they are, why they're important, and most importantly, how to use them in code. If you search online, you'll find a few different definitions of f-strings. Some use terms like literal strings and interpolation. To keep things simple, I'll define an f-string as a simplified way of formatting strings in Python that may include variables and expressions. Before you begin to learn how to use f-strings, it would make sense to understand why you'd want to use them in the first place. And the reason is that f-strings make the code shorter, more readable, and easier to understand. They're also faster than using other methods. The syntax of f-strings is pretty simple. You begin by typing the letter F. By the way, this F could be in lowercase or uppercase. Next, you open single or double quotation marks. You'll need to pick one or the other, as the opening and closing quotation marks need to match. Then you type any variables or expressions, including function calls, inside curly brackets. Finally, you add text to make the output understandable. Before we get to the actual coding part of this tutorial, if you're enjoying this video so far, give it a thumbs up and take this opportunity to subscribe to my channel. And don't forget to click on the notification bell so you don't miss out on my next videos. Well, the first step we're going to do is to define a few variables. I'm going to define a variable called name, and I'm going to assign the value Bob to it. Next, I'm going to call this one last name, and I'm going to assign the value Marley. Finally, I'm going to declare one more variable. This one I'm going to call age, and I'm just going to add the value 57. That's it. I'm going to run this cell just to make sure there's no errors. Great, nothing. So now I'm going to write a print function to display this information as output, but without any formatting. So I'm going to write print name, comma, last name, comma, age. Note that in this way of displaying the data, I'm separating each variable by a comma, and there'll be no formatting to this output. So let me just run this cell, and we get the display of Bob Marley 57. Sure, the data is there, but it's not interesting. It's not even formatted as English, so we can make it better. We're going to do that in the next cell. What I'm going to do is include these variables in the way that they are concatenated inside a print statement. I'm going to write print. The first variable is name. I'm going to use a plus sign followed by double quotes with a little space in between them. So we're going to create spaces in between these variables. Another plus sign. We're going to write the name of the next variable, which is last name. And followed by another plus sign. And we're going to say open quotation marks, space. I'm going to write is. Notice that I put spaces in between the word is on both sides because we don't want these words to run together, bunched together. We're going to say is, I'm going to say age. Now, before I can run this code, I have to make a little modification here. The first one is I forgot to add another plus sign here, concatenating last name, is, and age. The other change that I have to make is that age, if I click on here, it's going to say the age holds an integer, a number, not a string. We can't concatenate strings and integers together in Python. So what we have to do is convert this variable to a string, we're going to cast it as a string by using the str function on this age variable, like that. If I run this code now, it says Bob Marley is 57. I like to put a little exclamation mark. It has to be done within quotation marks, just like so. When I run it again, it says Bob Marley is 57. Okay, great. So we have the output the way we want it to, but I think that this method is a little tricky because you have to remember to separate the variables by a plus sign. You have to separate each one of them with spaces by including quotation marks. And you have to remember to cast any non-string variables as a string by calling the str function. So I think there's a better way. We're going to be using, in this example, the dot format function, but instead of concatenating the string just like we did in the example above, what we're going to do is we're going to be using placeholders for that. And we're going to do it like so. Print. We're going to open up quotation marks. I'm going to open up brackets. This first pair of brackets is going to hold the value of this variable name. Then the next pair of empty brackets, that's going to hold the value of this variable last name. And then we're going to say is, followed by another pair of empty brackets, which are here to hold the value of the age variable. And right after the last quotation mark, I'm going to do a little dot and write format. And inside the parentheses, what I'm going to do is I'm going to list the names of the variables that these placeholders are here to represent. So I have to separate these variables by commas like so. Name, last name, age. I can run this code the way I just wrote it without, and I don't think I'm going to get any errors. But one thing to note here is that as before in this previous example, I had to cast this age variable as a string because it was being concatenated with other strings. In this example here, when I'm using dot format function, I don't have to do that. All I have to do is to name the variables in the same order that we wish them to appear here in these placeholders. I'm going to run this cell, and it says Bob Marley is 57. I'm still missing the exclamation mark. I can add it right here, right before the last quotation marks, like that. I'm going to run that code again. Bob Marley is 57. Great. So I got the same output as above, but I think it's a little better now because there's fewer tricky things to remember. But I think we can still make this better. So we're going to do something similar. We're going to still be calling the dot format function, and we're going to use placeholders like we used before, but this time I'm going to use labels inside these brackets to mark the places and to indicate to the user what kind of data that's going to go in that particular location. So I'm going to write print. I'm going to open up quotation marks, brackets, brackets, is, bracket, exclamation mark, just like we did before. The difference now is that inside each bracket, I'm going to write a label to mark that placeholder, to indicate in that placeholder what kind of data that is going to hold. So I'm going to call it name. It's just, this is not a variable name. This is just like a label. Name, last name, age. Right after the quotation mark, I'm going to do dot format, open parentheses, and here, what I'm going to do is a little different than what I did before here. I'm going to have to say this label is linked. You can see this label is linked to the variable name. Separate that by a comma, and I'm going to say the label last name is associated now with the value contained in the variable last name. So I'm going to write last name, comma, and finally I'm going to say age. The label age is associated with the variable age, like so. And I'm going to run the cell. We got the same output. Bob Marley is 57. But I think that now it reads more like English. You can see last name, last name is of age. We're still using the dot format function. We still have to remember to input that information within the parentheses, this time using the labels equals the variable name, but I think that it reads better than just using empty brackets as placeholders. But we can still make it better. And now we're going to be using F strings to make this work. And you're going to see why F strings are more powerful, why I think they are better than using these other methods. I'm going to write print. Within parentheses, I'm going to write lowercase f, then followed by a pair of quotation marks. And then here, I'm going to open up brackets, just like we did before. Is like that. The difference now is that inside each of these empty brackets, I'm going to write the names of the variables that we want to display once we run this code. These are not going to be labels. These are going to be the actual variables that we defined all the way up here. So I'm going to say name, last name, and age, just like that. And that's it. I'm going to run this cell, and it prints the same output. Bob Marley is 57. The difference now is that the code is more succinct. It's simpler. It reads like English, and I think it's easier to understand. And it also runs much faster than using the other methods. So I think this is a great way to display strings in Python. This was added as part of the modifications that were done in Python version 3.6. So whereas before, the dot format was used more widely. But I like F strings better. But we can still make this more interesting because inside each of these brackets, we can, in this example, I used variables, but I can use expressions and I can use functions. So down below here, I'm going to show you an example of how to use a function, how to call a function from within one of these brackets. First, let's define a function. I'm going to say def full name, and I'm going to say it's going to take two arguments, a name and the last name. But just to show you that these are just names of parameters that I'm defining as part of the definition of this function here, I'm going to change them a little bit. I'm going to precede them with underscore. I'm going to say like that, name, comma, underscore, last name. And the reason why I'm doing this is so you don't get confused with name and last name here with a defined name and last name up here. In this cell, we have these variables already declared, and these values are assigned to these variables. Whereas in the function, we're just saying to the user that, hey, if you're going to use the full name function, you have to pass in a name and a last name. That's all. So these are not the same variables as above. All this function is going to do is return a concatenated string. I'm going to say name, just like we did before, plus open quotation marks with a little space in between to create space in between these variables. I'm going to write last name, like so. I'm going to run a cell to make sure that there's no errors. Good. Now, I'm going to write the print function, and within parentheses, I'm going to precede those quotation marks with a lowercase f to indicate this is an F string. Quotation marks. In between those quotation marks, I'm going to open up brackets. However, inside the first bracket, instead of writing name as the name of the variable name, like we did in this line here, what I'm going to do, I'm going to call this function full name because it's going to return a full name, not just a first name. Okay, it's going to be name and last name. So I'm going to say full name. And now it says here that I have to pass name and the last name. So now I'm going to pass in these actual variables over here. Okay. I'm going to say name, separate them by using a comma and last name. Okay, so now I'm going to say is. I'm going to open up brackets again, and this time, instead of passing a function name, I'm just going to pass in the same age variable that we used before. Okay, I'm going to use an exclamation mark here as well, just to make it interesting. And I'm going to run this cell. And it says Bob Marley is 57. I think that using F strings is more straightforward. I think it's easier, it's more powerful, it's simpler, easier to read. I think it's much better.